Welcome to our deep dive all about anger.
Huh.
You're interested in anger in the workplace, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is going to be really interesting because we're going way beyond, just like your basic assumptions about anger. And we're going to look closely at a PhD dissertation that explores anger in a whole new light.
It really does challenge the traditional view of anger. We tend to think of anger as this like huge outward explosion directed at someone else. But this research looks at the possibility of anger that's directed inward at ourselves.
Wait, hold on. Anger at yourself?
Yeah.
I always thought that anger had to be about blame. Like if you're angry, you're blaming someone, right?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because it turns out anger is not always about pointing fingers. This dissertation digs into the idea that anger can be much more complex, even turning inward. And before we get into all that, we need to lay some groundwork with appraisal theory.
Okay, so let's break that down. What is appraisal theory and how does it help us understand anger?
Appraisal theory basically says our emotions are triggered by how we interpret or appraise situations, not just the situations themselves. It's like, two people could spill coffee on their shirt but have totally different reactions. One person might laugh it off while the other person is fuming.
So it's not the coffee spill itself that causes the anger. It's how each person sees that spill. One person sees it as no big deal. The other person sees it as like a total disaster.
Exactly. And that's because they're appraising the situation differently, based on their own perspectives, their values, and their experiences. The dissertation we're looking at takes this idea of appraisal and applies it specifically to anger. And they look at how different appraisals can lead to different types of anger.
So you saying there are different types of anger? I always just thought anger was anger.
Well, this research actually distinguishes between what they call hot anger and cold anger. Think of hot anger as that really explosive rage, the kind that makes you want to yell and scream. Cold anger is more like simmering irritation or, like resentment or bitterness.
Interesting. So how do these different types of anger connect to this idea of anger directed at yourself?
That's where this research gets super fascinating to explore this. They designed an experiment to see how people react to frustration and how that frustration might lead to anger, both at others and at themselves.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this experiment. What did they do?
They had pairs of students work together to solve a puzzle. But here's the catch. The puzzle was designed to be impossible to solve.
An impossible puzzle. That's got to be frustrating. I can already imagine the tension.
Right. And to make it even harder, the students were under time pressure and they couldn't communicate with each other except in very limited ways. Oh, and each student had a slightly different version of the puzzle without even knowing it, so they were basically set up for failure.
Wow, that sounds like a recipe for some serious frustration and probably anger. But how does this impossible puzzle help us understand anger directed at oneself?
That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how the students reacted to this frustrating situation and how their personalities played a role in their emotional responses.
So last time we left off with those students struggling with that impossible puzzle, did they end up yelling at each other or did they turn that frustration inward?
Well, the researchers, they were really interested in that inward anger. They wanted to see, if people, when they're frustrated, if they actually get mad at themselves.
Okay.
And to figure that out, they looked at the students' personalities.
Okay, so how did personality play a role?
They looked at something called explanatory style, which is basically how you explain why things happen, especially bad things. Do you tend to blame yourself or do you blame outside forces? Are you pretty optimistic about why things happen, or are you more pessimistic?
So someone who has a more pessimistic explanatory style, if they fail that puzzle, are they more likely to get angry at themselves than at their partner?
Yeah, that's exactly what they wanted to find out, and the results were really surprising. They found that students who tend to blame themselves, what they call internals, they reported a lot more anger during the experiment, and a good chunk of that anger was directed inward.
Wow, that's really interesting. It kind of goes against what we usually think about anger. That's always about blaming someone else. But why would someone get angry at themselves? Wouldn't that just make a frustrating situation even worse?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why this research is so cool. One theory is that anger, even when it's directed at yourself, can actually be really motivating.
So it's like, I messed up, I'm mad at myself, but now I'm going to use that to do better next time.
Exactly. Think of it as a fiery form of self-motivation. You're not happy with how you get mad at yourself, and that pushes you to do better, to try harder next time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But couldn't that anger also be paralyzing? What if that anger makes you afraid to even try again because you're worried about failing?
You're right. That's a good point. It shows just how complex this self-directed anger can be. It's like a double-edged sword. It can push you to grow and get better, but if it's too much or if you don't handle it well, it can lead to, negative self-talk and beating yourself up and being scared to take risks.
So then, how do you find that balance? How do you know when that inner critic has gone too far and when it's becoming a problem?
That's a super important question, and it's something we'll dig into in the last part of our deep dive. We'll explore some of the downsides of this self-directed anger, and we'll talk about some strategies for managing that inner critic.
Okay, so we've been talking about this anger that we directed ourselves, and it can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? But how do we know when that inner critic, the one that's always telling us we messed up, has gone too far? Like, when does that become a problem?
Yeah, it's tough because it's different for everyone. We all experience anger differently. What might be okay for one person could be really bad for someone else. There's no, like, magic formula.
So there's no easy way to tell if that self-directed anger is a problem.
Not really, but there are some warning signs you can look out for, like how intense is that anger? Is it constant? Is it overwhelming? Is it like messing with your everyday life, your relationships, your work? If it is, and that's a sign, it might be an issue.
So it's not just like having a bad day or getting frustrated with yourself every now and then. It's more like if it's always there, like always simmering.
Right, exactly. And you should also think about how that anger is affecting what you do. Are you beating yourself up? Are you being super critical of yourself? Are you like sabotaging yourself? Those are all signs that the anger might be hurting you more than it's helping.
It's like that inner critic has become a bully instead of a coach.
Exactly. And that's where like traditional anger management stuff might not really help. They focus on controlling that outward anger, like yelling or getting aggressive, but they don't always deal with the anger that's directed at yourself.
So how do we manage that inner critic then? How do we deal with that anger that we're aiming at ourselves?
I think the most important thing is to be aware of it. You got to recognize when you're doing it, figure out what triggers it, and then find some healthier ways to cope. So instead of letting that anger control you, you learn to understand it and use it in a better way.
So you're not trying to like squash the anger or let it explode. You're
Mhm.
finding a way to like work with it, make it work for you.
Exactly. It might mean challenging those negative thoughts, being kinder to yourself, or even talking to a therapist to help you work through those feelings in a healthy way.
So this research is really making us rethink how we see anger,
Mm,
both in ourselves and in other people. It's not just about blame or aggression. It's a lot more complicated than that. And once we understand that, we can handle it better.
definitely. And for you, thinking about anger at work, it means recognizing that anger, even when it's directed at yourself, it's a normal human emotion. It's about understanding how that anger might be affecting your work, your relationships with your coworkers, and even how happy you are at your job.
And if that anger is becoming a problem, you can do something about it.
Mm.
It's not about becoming some robot who doesn't feel anything. It's about learning how to manage that anger in a way that's good for you and helps you succeed.
Well said. This deep dive has really helped us understand how complex anger is. It's made us question some of the things we thought we knew about anger.
I feel like I have a totally different perspective on anger. Now, this has given me a lot to think about both at work and in my personal life.
It's been great talking about this with you.
And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights about anger, especially in the workplace. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to understanding ourselves and our emotions. Until next time.